The medieval era in history is probably the most widely known, the most romanticised, and is dominated by war and conflict, and Creative Assembly launched into this era in 2006 with Medieval II: Total War. And this game is regarded by many players as the best Total War game in the Total War franchise. Ever since then, players have been begging Creative Assembly, the studio behind Total War, for Medieval 3. But after 18 years since the launch of Medieval 2, has time run out for Medieval 3? To find out, we have to go back in time to the golden era of Total War. Starting off with the obvious choice, Rome 1, the first truly 3D, large-scale, immersive Total War. Let's move on to the second game immediately. Medieval 2 improved on everything in Rome 1, with deeper campaign mechanics such as invasions, the introduction of gunpowder, crusades, jihads, and arguably the best expansion DLCs ever created for a single Total War game. Empire, a lot of people have problems with, a lot of people love it, a lot of people hate it, but even though it's still a buggy mess, it is the most ambitious historical Total War campaign ever. And you also have to remember, this game came out just 3 years after Medieval 2. 2 years if you count the Kingdoms expansion. Think of Medieval 2, then think of Empire. The graphical difference is incredible. The scale is incredibly different. Ship battles, we have trade, resources, gunpowder is the main focal point. A lot of things have changed, and yes, they didn't get it right initially, but we have to give them a little bit of grace for that. Because Empire, for all its flaws, is ambitious in its vision, but it's let down by the AI not being capable enough to fight a player on such a big campaign map, along with the battle AI being completely useless.
And now it's time for Editing Room with Pompey.
Oh guys, I don't know about you, but I'm getting a bit worked up in the editing room right now. Now you may think, why am I showing you a random dude? This was the advanced tactics, or whatever it was called, for Empire Total War. Just listen to what this guy says. Just listen to this.
The special thing about it is that it's a form of behavior that the AI tries to use, which involves keeping as much cohesion as possible and running through a set plan as much as it can within the remit of what the player does. And
you ever seen an AI run a cohesive strategy in your life in Empire? I just had to leave that in. Anyway, back to the video. Napoleon is a mixed bag for a lot of people, but I think for the wrong reasons. People say that it's too small, it's not as grand as Empire, and that's obviously true. But if you think that, you're missing the point. Napoleon focuses on Napoleon because his achievements are so outstanding. Personally, I don't think Napoleon is enough. It's too big. The best campaigns are the Italian, Peninsula, and the Egyptian campaign, and the reason for that is because they focus in on the micro. Napoleon was good not because of his massive empire, but the fact that he was able to outmaneuver everybody. He was an incredible tactician. You can only achieve that level of tactics and strategy on a more micro scale. The European campaign's good, it achieves the scale, but it lacks the ability for you to really use strategy and tactics to outmaneuver your enemies. Finally, the Jewel in the Crown, although Rome 1, Medieval 2, still great games. Shogun II and Fall of the Samurai expansion. We could talk about graphics that still hold up today. Go back to Shogun II, you can play that game and not have any mods on it. The ambience, the majesty of the animations, artistic and in-depth campaign. But I think Shogun II's biggest strength, that is often not talked about, is that it was simple to understand. Rock, paper, scissors functionality that allowed players to get into the game in the masses. Recently we've seen Helldivers 2 come out of nowhere, and its success is mainly down to the fact that it's very easy to get into and it's a huge wide player base, and also it's quite addictive, and Shogun 2 had the same effect. Sword beats spear, spear beat cav, and cav beats sword. Missile damages everything, and everything beats missiles in melee. Very, very easy to understand. You always had your unique units that went outside the box, outside the triangle. That's what made the gameplay replayable. Unlike an Empire where you could easily break the AI, but that would ruin your historical gameplay experience and it wasn't fun. Breaking the triangle in Shogun 2 was the objective, in my opinion. How could you beat an army of swords with only spears, for example? That was the challenge. And then there's the expansion, of course, the legendary Fall of the Samurai campaign that throws Shogun 2 on its head with the introduction of gunpowder. After Shogun 2 Fall of the Samurai, excitement, hope and pride were back in Total War. I remember the day when the Rome 2 trailer came out, The Siege of Carthage.
The final game's actually going to look way, way better than this.
I think everyone thought it was incredible, and that's the high that we were living off. Shogun 2. Rome 2 has to be better than Shogun 2, surely. Rome 1 was incredible after all, but after the release of Rome 2 and the subsequent realization that this had all been rushed, badly thrown together, and unthought and untested in many ways, the optimism in Total War historical community crashed, and personally I don't think it ever recovered to where it was on the aftermath of For the Samurai. You had Attila come out, never had the same draw as Medieval 2, really badly optimized. The cursed release of Thrones of Britannia, I personally like that game because I'm from the UK. That's kind of, relatable to me, but it really crushed any rays of hope that Attila brought back from Rome 2. And from that, I didn't even play Three Kingdoms. Let's not even talk about Troy or Pharaoh. They've been covered extensively by other YouTubers, and I've not even bought the games because I've never really had any inclination to buy them. So we have 5 Golden Era games: Rome 1, Medieval 2, Empire, Napoleon and Shogun 2, and 5 Dark Age games, which was be Rome 2, Attila, Thrones of Britannia being an expansion of Attila, then we have Three Kingdoms, and then we have Troy and Pharaoh. So now we've had 2 of those sets of 5. My question is, what will the next era of historical Total War bring? And let's be honest, there's only one title that everyone wants, and that is Medieval 3. But unfortunately, I don't believe that the spark that was ignited in the golden era of Total War is still burning strong. Even if Medieval 3 was announced right now, the studio Creative Assembly is run, managed and developed by a completely different developer team. Medieval 2 was 18 years ago. I would be surprised if many of those people who made that game are still on the staff, which is fine because companies grow, but also you lose that sense of identity in the original games, and that definitely shows in these later games. There's also the issue of what the game would actually look like, how complex it would be. I think the biggest problem for historical Total War is its weird middle ground between how much weight it puts on characters and how much weight it puts on units. For example, the fantasy games, the Warhammer games, are fantastic because they focus in on the tabletop game, but primarily is focused on characters, and so Total War Warhammer puts incredible weight on those characters, and the units around them are more like a supporting element to the game. Yes, you have credible missile units, incredible artillery pieces, but most of the damage gets done by individual characters. And so for the past 3 games, that's what Total War was really focused in on, the characters, and it didn't work in Three Kingdoms. Remember that they had a historical mode where all those things weren't part of the game, but it felt really empty and dry. It didn't feel like a historical game at all, and that was a problem that game suffered from. It wasn't interesting enough without the characters being OP. The rock paper effect of Shogun II wasn't present. It looked gimmicky and ahistorical. Adding completely ridiculous factions into the game, for me personally, was the reason I didn't play, like Tigers. So if Medieval 3 goes down that road, we're going to be looking at an absolute disaster. Total War have got to figure out who they're making their game for. Are they making it for the historical fans, or are they making it for the fantasy fans? Stick to one, not both, because otherwise we're going to have a complete Pharaoh, Troy, Three Kingdoms disaster. So where does that leave us? It leaves us at a crossroads. Medieval 3 can be 1 or 2 games. It can lean heavily into mythology, but still retain the medieval style. At this point, however, you may as well just make a Lord of the Rings game. Medieval 3 set in Europe with fantasy would be interesting, but apart from that, having dragons would be cool, but it wouldn't really have any impact. Why don't you just make a Lord of the Rings game, have all this crazy lore that you can work with, have loads of interesting things, but still have a high focus on individual units? And interestingly, a lot of historical fans love Third Age, love Lord of the Rings, and so that could be a good bridge to build between the 2 factions. But for this video, I want to focus on what would happen if Total War went down the other road, which would be to go to strictly medieval, no fantasy whatsoever. If you even try and go down the middle and dip into both fantasy and historical, you'll find yourselves in the barren wasteland of Three Kingdoms. I could see a dragon DLC, like Troy had a mythology DLC, that kind of worked, but it only worked because the base game wasn't built around fantasy, it was built around historical. So focusing on option 2, strictly medieval, how could Creative Assembly accomplish this? Now, the obvious rival to a Total War game set in medieval times is Paradox's Crusader Kings 3, which is ultra complex with full player control over everything, and that is a great sandbox experience, but it's not Total War. And Total War has the advantage of being complex but also simple enough for you to understand. I could drop someone into a Total War game that had never played it before far easier than I could drop someone into a Paradox game. But a Total War game, you're focused on the war aspect, and the economy comes afterwards, and the economy is based around what you do in the war aspect of the game. I like what they did with Troy with the different resources, but if we go too far down that road, we're starting to dip into, are we actually making Crusader Kings 3 with cooler battles? And that could be good. If we're going to stick to the war side of Total War and have the economics support that, there are some things that could make Medieval 3 much more engaging and more interesting. Number one is something people have requested in Rome 2 for a long time, and that was family trees. Now again, we are leaning into a little bit more complex economic side of this, but players since Rome 1 loved to immerse themselves in the lineage of their chosen faction's family, and I think this is just a staple. You have to have this, otherwise there's no player connectivity with the faction. And in medieval times, the throne held all the power. Having direct lineage to the throne was enough to raise armies, start wars and change nations. We often had challenges to the throne, usurpers. That's how kingdoms would change ownership, often overnight, often several times, and different powers would support those claims to the throne, obviously wanting to have influence after that person has risen to power. And that was how wars were really fought in medieval times. So the family tree needs to be an essential part of the game, but its UI and actions that you can take cannot be overcomplicated. I think Rome 2's political intrigue mechanics were a textbook example of how not to build a family tree, lineage, or a court intrigue system. I still don't really understand. I'm not really a massive Rome 2 player, but it's not explained to you at all what these things do. They seem to have no consequence on your game. You could play the entire game and not even touch the political tree or the political intrigue, and that's really disappointing. It has no real influence over the game, but also you could just go the entire game without even understanding it or wanting to understand it. And the way it should work is the player has to be able to do things but have an objective and not just be able to do whatever you want seemingly randomly. So for example, I can assassinate this person and make peace with this person, and the next turn I can do the opposite. If you're going to make a family tree that you're supposed to connect with, seemingly random events put together are not going to help you connect. The next big juggernaut of medieval times is religion. In Europe, the church and the breakaway from Catholicism and the rise of Islam in the East was a never-ending tension and igniter of conflict in medieval times. The church had immense power, and Islam and the Islamic world were a direct threat to that power, and vice versa. I would view religion as kind of a blockage to player freedom, which is good in the sense that the player can still do whatever they want, but if they do, then there's dire consequences, like attacking another Catholic faction will lead you to be excommunicated and suddenly everyone hates you. That's what Medieval 2 did. Right. The third important thing that Medieval 3 needs to get right is trade and resources. A huge focus of the medieval age was the control of trade and resources. An acquisition of the Holy Land for trade control was a huge driving factor for many crusades. If you think about the position of where the Holy Land is, whoever controls that easily accessible part of land, a very slim part of land, controls all the trade. Control of those trade routes was so essential to the continuing growth of Europe that it was deemed to be so important to send several crusades out to try and capture that. But the riches that came from access to the east and to Egypt were far more important to a lot of people than the religious reasons. And if Medieval 3 doesn't acknowledge this, it will be seriously undermining the value placed on the acquisition of knowledge and wealth in the medieval age. And last but by no means least, is probably the most important creative decision of the game, the balance between character and faction. Now, how much weight do you put on individual characters and how much on factions? Now, Three Kingdoms lost the magic of Shogun II because it's put so much weight on the characters of the game and their individual stats and abilities. Troy and Pharoah did the same, but especially Pharoah with immensely powerful characters and meaningless and often overlooked units. The insane power of the generals in Three Kingdoms was just absolutely blown out of proportion, and it put a lot of people off the historical franchise, including myself, for a long time. This is why I don't think, or don't know, to be honest, if Creative Assembly still have it in them to build a Medieval 3 Total War that is reminiscent of that golden era. The golden era of Total War wasn't successful because of the characters in the game. It was successful because even in Napoleon Total War, which is centered around Napoleon himself, it found the right balance between characters and units. Characters still had an impact and were still important, but were not overwhelming. They weren't the central reason why you did well. They were always a supporting factor. They weren't powerhouses, they supported but left the fighting to the armies they commanded and not the other way around. Let's take a medieval character, for example, Richard the Lionheart. Imagine he was so overpowered that he can individually take on units by himself, just like 3 kingdoms. If that happens, Medieval 3 is finished before it even can begin. If, however, he is a non-combatant unit, or more likely, he's integrated it into an actual combat unit, like it was in Thrones of Britannia, which I thought did that quite well, that could work better and is more believable. There's lots that could be said about what could make Medieval 3 a success, but unless this is gotten right, the balance between character and unit, then everything else like Pharaoh, like 3 Kingdoms will be meaningless. And if they do end up making a Medieval 3 and it's a failure at launch, it's quite possible we could see Total War move exclusively into the fantasy genre. The historical player base wouldn't take it at all, and that's how important this final core gameplay decision is. Personally, I don't think Medieval 3 is going to happen. I think they'll go Third Age Total War, and it's something that medieval fans love, and it's something that fantasy fans also love. Personally, I could get behind that quite easily, as much as I could get behind a Medieval 3. Well, I hope you enjoyed my overview of the Total War franchise and what may potentially come next in the historical genre. Personally, I have no idea. It could be anything at this point, let's be honest. Let me know your thoughts on the game, the aspects of it, what could work, what couldn't. I'm genuinely interested, and if you enjoyed this video and want more overviews like this, drop a like and subscribe.